All right. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Javier. I'm a senior solutions engineer at Auth0, which is now is a product unit of Okta since last year's acquisition. And in today's session, we're gonna talk about the basics of identity management and how it has evolved from just being a tool to control internal access for employees in the workplace into a core asset for any digital business strategy. Along the way, I'm going to highlight some of the complexities on identity, as well as some common threats that we see today. Really here that is to kind of raise awareness of how complicated it is to build a secure identity system from scratch. Then I'm going to close off with some thoughts on what I think are the future trends in the overall identity ecosystem. And then at the end, there's going to be, I reckon, like 50 minutes or so for Q&A in case anyone has any questions. So I'll take a look at the chat, and then at the end, I'll address those questions. Okay, so let's start with the basics of identity, right? So what is identity? Identity, in a nutshell, you can think about digital identities as a set of attributes that define the entities in the digital world. And in that definition, there is who they are and what they can do, so that they can ultimately authenticate into your systems, and they can also make use of your resources and APIs. Now, these entities do not necessarily need to match exactly with people in the physical world. Machines themselves also need to have identities. Think about any bash script, any cron job, or maybe a microservices architecture. Essentially any sort of program that needs or wants to interact with an API without the need of an end user driving that flow also needs a digital identity. Now, when people think about implementing identity themselves, most of the times they will just consider adding a login box to their applications so that the users can, provide credentials, typically in the form of a username and password. They will get logged in, and then they will get some kind of artifact like a cookie or a JSON web token, and they will use that artifact to access the API. So, and all of it looks and it seems quite straightforward and easy, right? But in reality, implementing a proper identity and access management solution is a lot more harder than you may be thinking. And so you not only need to implement these standard flows to manage identities, such as the registration flow, forgot password, account removal. You also need to consider that in some cases, your users would not want to create yet another digital identity with you, but instead they want to bring their existing ones via social providers like Facebook or using enterprise identity providers. And this could be due to choice, or it could be due to compliance reasons. For example, when you look into the B2B space, some customers cannot afford using an external service unless their employees access those systems with their internal identities. You also need to consider the authorization piece. How do you make sure that only certain people with a certain level of access can access your resources? There's also the data residency component, right? For businesses in the European Union, if you want to comply with GDPR, you want to make sure that your users' data is in the European Union and it never leaves the European Union unless there is consent in between. You also want to consider the integrations with third-party systems. This would be CRMs, ERPs, etc. The idea is that you can leverage this information to the most. And then, of course, there is the actual cost involved in not only building the system from scratch, but also you got to keep it up to date, and you want to make sure that you meet service level agreements in terms of resiliency, availability, durability, etc. So as you can see, the login box is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to managing digital identities, in a way that is not going to be detrimental to your business. So authentication and authorization both are critical to every business, and implementing it right and in a way that you can provide a secure and seamless user experience is very hard. So Implementing it, if you implement identity badly, you can have pretty bad consequences. So aside from the economic impact that it can have in your business, which is something I'm gonna talk about in a second, what's more important is that trust is being compromised, and identity is all about trust. Your customers trust you with their data, and they also trust that you have the mechanisms in place to secure that personal information in case anything happens, and you will never let it go away without their consent. Once you lose that trust, it's very difficult to gain it back, and in many cases is the reason why businesses disappear altogether. This is why there is a radical change in how modern businesses approach identity these days. They start to approach identity as something that is much more than just a tool or just a tool or a login box. Instead, as Gartner puts it in his research on managing external identities using SIAM tool. According to Gartner, IAM, Identity and Access Management, is today a cross-functional requirement and is considered the focal point of an organization's digital business strategy. So identity is at the center of your business because your customers, your employees, your partners, they are what truly matter. Thing is, if identity is such a core and cross-departmental component for every business, why is it that we are treating like this from day one? And this is because traditionally, identity access management decisions have been made solely by the IT department. And the reason for it is because identity started in the workplace. Traditional identity access management, the traditional one is all about the employees, right? And it's all about providing the proper access on at least the privilege principle. In this type of identity and access management, we see standard software being used, such as HR, accounting, CRM software. That would be the software that the employees need to access. Identity is considered or is all about mitigating business risk, because it's important to secure high value assets and information, which means that you want to make sure that additional steps such as MFA or hardware tokens, you want to enforce those without the user, or in this case the employee having much of a choice. When you look at the UX, a rather complicated UX is often seen as a collateral damage. So that would be the traditional context, the kind of the IT or decisions that were made in the past, because identity was mostly an IT subject to consider. But over time, identity broke through the boundaries of the physical offices to also consider the identities of the actual customers, who are the ultimate users of the services these companies created. And this new form of identity is what we called customer identity, also called SIAM. So with customer or consumer identity, things are a bit different. Here, identity is all about the consumer. So the more you know the customer, the better. It's often, a previously unknown audience. Anybody can sign up for your online service, while, over time you're building up that user profile. Here, the user experience is key. Otherwise, the user will just move on to the next best competitor. And also, trust is key. Like, trust is always key in all sense. But in this case, trust is more opinionated, right? Like, people will ask you, so what do you do with the user's data? Can you, as a service provider, be trusted in terms of security and also data privacy? For convenience, also, security. What's going to happen is that users will want to reuse their existing social media accounts for login, which is actually also beneficial for both sides, because from the service provider side, it allows you to gather additional information without having to explicitly ask the user about it. If you look into the SIAM landscape or the identity landscape, the way we look at it is it's like this, right? We have here identity, the workforce identity to the left, which will be the traditional one, and then you have customer identity to the right. If you zoom into the SIAM world, you can distinguish between different type of use cases based on the nature of these identities. So the way we look at this is as follows. The first one will be the consumer applications. This will be more the B2Cs of the world, right? Like anybody building applications that are meant to be used by consumers. we are all consumers in one way or another, right? So we are users of e-commerce sites, we are users of media and entertainment sites like Netflix, etc. So that would be the first SIAM category. The second one is the bubble on the bottom right. That's the SaaS applications. This is people who are building applications not for the consumers, but for the businesses. And this would be an example would be Zoom, Workday, Salesforce. This will be the B2B part of it. And you can look at these SaaS applications as the other side of the coin of workforce. You log in as workforce into a SaaS application, but someone else is building those applications. Another third one is what we call external collaboration. And this is a situation, in which essentially a company augments their own workforce by, hiring vendors, suppliers, contractors, any individual who are, technically not your employees, but they act as your workforce, so that we can, we call them external collaborators. The difference is that, for the B2Cs and B2Bs, the identities are self-managed, right? On the B2C case, the identity of the user itself is managed by the user. In the B2B SaaS, it will be managed by the company who's hiring those services. Here, when you look into the external collaboration piece, what you see is these are managed systems, and the identities are not self-managed. Instead of they are managed by the organization itself. The organization is trying to grow their workforce. So as you can imagine, the total addressable market for SIAM is huge, right? Because the amount of SaaS and consumer applications are increasing by the day, thanks in big part to the development of new cloud technologies. And this is why Okta decided to acquire Auth0 last year for a hefty price of $6.5 billion, which is a huge amount of money. But when you look at it from the perspective of the potential SIAM market, which is estimated to be around $30 billion, you see that it actually makes sense, right? Now the idea is that Okta more sitting on the workforce side and Auth0 more on the SIAM side can join forces to create a single identity cloud that can tackle or can support any digital identity strategy. And according to Gartner, by 2024, organizations that implement a cohesive customer identity and access management solution will have 30% better customer retention and 50% fewer customer breaches than those that don't. So why is it important, right? Regardless of whether if it's B2B, B2C, B2E, there's a common denominator in all these cases for in written identity. And that's security, right? Security is intrinsic to any identity solution because, as I said earlier, identity is about trust. When you have a solution that can cover all the identity spectrum, you automatically will benefit from the network effects. This graph that you see right here is from the cost of a data breach report, which is an annual report by IBM, which offers insights around more than 500 real breaches, and it helps us understand better, the security risk and how they evolve over time. So what you see here is that last year, the average total cost of a data breach was estimated to be something between $4 and $4.5 million, which is up 10% from last year. For many startups, this might well mean the end of the journey. Here at Auth0, we oversee around more than 6 billion logins transactions per month. For that, all the traffic, we see that 67% is being suspicious. So when you choose an identity solution, you benefit from the continuous learning and reinforcement of that network. The most typical type of attack that we see in our networks, that's credential staffing attacks. These attacks, what they do is that they take advantage of the common practice of password reuse. So when a user reuses the same or a similar password on multiple sites, it creates a domino effect in which a single credential pair can be used to breach multiple applications. And the primary motivation for credential staffing is account discovery or validation. And the ultimate goal is to develop a high quality list of credentials that can be later sold on the dark web. One example would be if you could sell streaming accounts on Netflix at a lower price than the subscription rate. the most credential stuffing attacks are relatively simple in the sense that all they do is use brute force to process a long list of breached credentials. And unfortunately, the barrier to launching these attacks is very low, because today you can, renting a botnet is relatively easy and cheap. You can also, there's a lot of rotating IP services, and automating this, automating the components into an attack is relatively straightforward if you know how to code. So here we have some, data from our network. What you see here is the first 90 days of 2021 from last year. In this case, Credential Staffing accounted for around 20% of the attempted login traffic in our platform. We saw a peak of around 40% near the end of March. You see different patterns per vertical. At the top, there is the first 90 days for governmental institutions. At the bottom will be for the financial industry. Even though they seemingly happen in different time frames, they typically average the same number of attacks, regardless of the industry. This is because particularly large attacks exert enormous influence on the averages. So if you look at the financial service graph too, 2 attacks made up more than 90% of the total. And these are both particularly interesting industries for hackers due to the importance of their data. In the financial industry, the need for online identity proofing has become much more common as more high-value transactions are handled digitally. All right, so what do you do, right, to protect, or how you protect your users and APIs against these constant threats? So first of all, you've got to have a really powerful engine that kind of gates every login transaction so that only legit users can access your resources. And such engine needs to take into consideration a number of different variables. For example, the quality of the IP address, in the sense of has this IP address been linked to previous attacks? Are the credentials provided by the user recently been involved in any major data breach occurring on any other third-party site? Is there any sign of impossible travel? And impossible travel means when, for example, someone logs into your website from New York, and then an hour later they sign in from Amsterdam, something that is technically impossible today. Also want to double check how many requests are coming from this IP address, and are they occurring at a rate that doesn't seem humanly possible. So like, as you can imagine, building an engine like this from scratch is really complicated, and probably not what most of the businesses want to spend their time on. So in the case of Auth0, we oversee the traffic across our 9,000 plus enterprise customers to block and protect any type of attacks towards the identity systems, and also to learn from new evolving threats. On the application side, you want to make sure that you use technologies that are based on open standards, such as OpenID Connect or Auth2O, etc., and rather than reinventing the wheel or using a proprietary technology, because if you use a proprietary technology, that could put you at risk of vendor lock-in. Ideally, you want to find a solution that can handle multiple languages and platforms. The more is the case the solution provides, the better, because it allows for faster and easier implementation, since you don't have to learn the nitty-gritties of each protocol. As an example, the Auth2O specification recommends different types of authorization flows based on the application type, right? So if it's a single page application, you want to do a code flow with Pixie. If it's an API machine, you want to do client credentials exchange. You want to have a solution that handles the underlying complexity for you, because essentially you can easily focus on making it, or you implementing your use cases via simple API calls or SDK calls, rather than learning how to implement each protocol. Another thing is, you want to choose a solution that is API first. At Auth0, many of our customers don't really even bother opening the browser to manage their tenants configuration. Instead, they do everything programmatically via the management API. This allows them to create their own interfaces so that they can also delegate the administration of that data to maybe partners, specific employees, or even the end users themselves. They can also import, export the data, and they can have that added to the version control repository. So that's how you're gonna keep your configurations code. Ultimately, you can also hook all this code into your CD pipeline and allow for automatic testing and deployment before hitting production. Really, here the idea is that because identity is such a core component in your overall digital strategy, you want to make sure you have a solution that supports the best software development lifecycle practices. Right. So last but not least, here, want to close off, highlighting some of the future trends that we see in the identity space. These are, I think this is quite obvious today. Passwordless. I think we all know already that passwords are inefficient. Like, our brain is not really optimized to create and retain 1,000 passwords, one for every site we visit. This is why we naturally fall back to reusing passwords, which leads to the credential stuffing attacks that we saw earlier. When you need to basically when you need to prove your identity, you either do it by something that something that you have, or something that you are. Passwordless tries to make use of the factors of something that you have or are, which will be, for example, something that you have might be your email address, or you can prove your email address when you log in, or maybe you want to prove an SMS OTP when it's gets sent to you. Something that you are would be more appropriate with the device biometric technologies. And so there will be, for example, the fingerprint on your laptop, on your phone. It can also be your face recognition device. That's something that my colleague Sam is going to talk about in a later session, which is more about how WebAuthn, which is the technology behind it, can allow for seamless passwordless experiences. Now the other one is the Web3, and also the decentralized identity that comes with it. I think this is an interesting one because blockchain technology is getting more widespread adoption these days. And so Web3, gentle introduction, right? The Web3 is basically an umbrella for a suite of peer-to-peer technologies to build decentralized applications in programmable blockchains, like, for example, Ethereum or Solana. Bitcoin is also another blockchain, but is more difficult to program with. The decentralized nature of this blockchain is what allows people and organizations to verifiably prove things about themselves in a privacy-preserving way. Everybody that participates in the ecosystem will have a private key on that blockchain, and that key is being distributed to the users themselves. And now, using elliptic curve signature, you can compute a public key, which is kind of a public address in this blockchain database. So that's like your identification in the blockchain, let's say. The blockchain really acts as a global attestation layer towards digital assets that are stored in it. So you can use this private key to sign transactions that verify your identity, and then also the ownership of a specific data structures that are inside the blockchain. What this means is that you could complement your authentication and your authorization layer to access your APIs or resources by checking against the blockchain, because the data in the blockchain is public, and basically anyone can just go there, trace it, and also verify it. So, for example, consider you have an API that lets you access certain sport events. What you could do is you could check the blockchain, for example, Ethereum, and say, well, because you are the owner of this NFT, or because you have made this donation to this NGO in the past, then you can get access to this resource API. You can also build up a public user profile, because any application can consult that data that is publicly available. Now, on the flip side, you don't want to, from the privacy perspective, you don't want to have all your public data available so that anyone can look into that. There is also the concept of privacy preserving attestation layer, where, following kind of a zero knowledge proof principle, you can also check that, for example, a user is over 18 or that they are a member of the European Union if that person has a certain number of transactions in this blockchain, or maybe that person has interacted in the past with a specific smart contract. So, it's a way to kind of prove identity without really having to give away all the data necessarily. So the way we look at this space is Web3 won't replace Web2, but instead it will complement it. We believe companies will need to support the concept of an identity that is issued by another party, but the consumer is actually owning the data. That's the decentralized part, right? But they will also need a hub that centralizes their own policies, and they use a data store to solve their use cases. And that's the centralized part, more like in our case, it would be Auth0. With that perspective, we are also partnering with a few vendors in the space like Matter, and we're also running internal experiments where we allow people to sign into your applications using their digital wallets, like, for example, MetaMask, so that they can, using the private key that is in the MetaMask wallet for Ethereum, for example, they can get into your application securely. And this is the screenshot that you're seeing here in the presentation. Now, another trend that we see, this will be Auth201. Auth201, sorry. So this is an effort that is led by one of our core security architects called Aaron Parecki. And what it is just a revision of the current Auth2O spec with, the overarching goal of really simplify the spec and make it more approachable, because, people really struggle to understand it. The original spec of Auth2O was created back in 2012, and since then things have changed drastically and in a way that we couldn't envision. So as a result, new specs have been introduced in the form of RFCs, and with it, new things have been added, concepts have been removed, or they have been updated over time, which means that for you to get a firm understanding of Auth2O today, it will require you long hours of reading, which, in my opinion, is not scalable at all. It would be far better if we just draw the latest and most updated draft, and we take it from there. So Auth201 has been proposed already for 3 years, but given the community nature it has, and because everyone needs to reach to a consensus, it's quite a slow decision-making process. It will probably take a while until we see it implemented. And then last but not least, credential staffing attacks. This shouldn't be a surprise, right? The more we embrace technology and go digital for our day-to-day use cases, the more attractive it will be for hackers to go after that data. Attacks will become more sophisticated over time, which is why we are investing heavily in security and research and development, really to keep up with that pace, to secure our client base. All right. So what I'm gonna do now, let me actually switch to the chat in case there are any questions. Okay, cool. Logging in from Amsterdam directly versus, I'm just gonna add this one question here, impossible logins. How do you try to avoid the false positive logging in from Amsterdam versus logging in, which may be in fact New York? That's a great question here. So the attack protection, so yeah, I'm gonna read it aloud, by the way, sorry. Regarding impossible logins, how do you try to avoid false positives? For example, logging in from Amsterdam directly versus through VPN, which may be in fact in New York. So that's a problem that we see. I mean, our technology can take into account in a way when an IP address comes from a VPN to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, that can become a problem, and that's something that we also tell our customers. there are two ways around it, right? There is when you use an attack protection engine, such as the one in Auth0 or maybe another from identity provider, ideally you should be able to also extend or have an influence on that decision-making process. In the case of Auth0, whenever a transaction occurs, you're going to have contextual information from the transaction. So you can also get to know the IP address of the user, and you can also do impossible logins check yourself with your own logic, which is something that you will write, using JavaScript. But you can also get that info and export it to another third-party system that does that work better. So it's not that you are completely logged in to the capabilities of the engine by, in this case, Auth0 itself. You can also complement it, and if you think that there might be false positives because of VPN, and there's a way around it, you can also kind of work around that problem. But yeah, this is something. If people use VPNs, which sometimes they do, it's very likely that there's going to be a false positive in that case. Right. Any other questions on the chat? Because I think we still have 20 minutes, so feel free to ask any questions. All right. I mean, if there are no more questions, I can improvise a demo of Auth0 if you guys want, or whatever. I'm happy doing that as well. Whatever you just let me know in the chat, then I can talk to other things around identity that not necessarily and in the presentation itself. Okay, there we have another one. Thank you, Gabor. So do you do social login aggregation to social sites to log in with them instead of having to create own credentials? Yeah, so that's actually really easy. When you implement authentication with Auth0, one of the things that you do first, you're gonna register your applications. So ideally, your apps will be communicating with an authorization server that sits in the cloud, and then that server is the one who's going to provide authentication and authorization. When someone wants to provide their credentials, and they're going to get redirected to a central domain for login purposes, and so in that domain, there's different options. But let's say you have a widget for login. What you can do is that you can hook that login box, the backend, with a database, or which would be a database that is hosted in your tenant in Auth0, but it could also be an API endpoint that provides authentication. So you could also kind of proxy your requests to what we call a custom DB. So that would be a custom connection to your existing web API, which is the one providing authentication. Another thing you can do as well is that you can complement the authentication process by adding social providers, which will be more the case on the B2C aspect. On the B2B side, it would be more like enterprise federations towards maybe SAML systems, or maybe something like Azure AD. The thing is, with the social connectors, what you can do is it's really easy. There's around 40 social connectors that are already out of the box. So you essentially, what you do is you turn them on on your tenant, and then they will automatically appear on your login box. And so what this allows you to do is that you can allow for faster kind of login experiences. What you can also do is that you can link different social identities together. So the same person, let's say you're providing social logins with Facebook or Google, you can link both accounts so that regardless of the authentication method they use, in the end, they are the same user on your application. And that's important because, otherwise you're going to have a disjointed experience if you have the same person being, having two different digital identities just because of the connectors. But yeah, good question. I think there is like 15 more minutes. I'm just gonna leave maybe wait in the chat if there is any more questions coming in for the next 2-3 minutes. Otherwise I might as well just show you, because there's not much questions. Just gonna show. If there are no more questions, I might as well just show you the social connectors, which I can show you here actually. Just see. Switch. So, okay, you're gonna see my development environment right here. Let me just show you. If I switch to, to the demo environment that I have. This that you see right here, this is the dashboard, by the way. This is where you can control your tenant and your kind of your configuration. So here, as I was saying before, you have different authentication methods. As you can see here, these are the social connectors. These are really easy to set up because if you want to create a new connector, you basically choose among the different social providers. What you can do also is that you don't need to learn how the API of the social provider works or what the attributes are. Basically, for example, if we look at Google, what you need to do is you create that connection with the client ID and client secret, and then you get to choose the permissions or the amount of information that you want to require from the user. And this is just really what it is. Now, when you enable this, or let's say if we want to make use of these connectors, you got to choose the application for which this connection is a valid authentication method. In my case, I have this Travel Zero application, which I can show you in a second. This is a demo app that I typically use for my customer calls. Now that this is enabled, this is the application itself. It's just a demo app. If I log out, we'll see here, and then I log in again. I get redirected to this kind of a central page for login, and you see here that the social connector appears as one option to login, which is a much more seamless approach than you have to do email address and password. So you just log in, and when you hit there, you have this SSO experience where you reuse the session in the identity provider, and then you can fully log in. Okay, cool. Let's see if there are more questions here coming in. Maybe, because there is time, what I can also talk about here, in case there are any questions on this. How do we do the APIs, right? Given that this is an API event. The APIs, how they are protected with the platform. When you raise your applications, you also want to register your APIs, and the process is actually quite simple. You're basically going to register the APIs here. I got 3 already created, so let's look into this one. This one here is my expenses API, let's say. So I create an instance in my authorization server about this API. And this will be the identifier. And this is important because, whenever an application requests an access token to interact with the API, there's going to be a claim called audience, and the audience is an identifier towards that API. So when let's say when an application wants to interact with the API, you want to make sure that you decomposed. Let's actually do Node maybe. You want to have a middleware, and this middleware, what it does is that for every request that gets to the API, you want to make sure that the JWT is actually coming from your authorization server, which will be the one in this case in Auth0. And you also want to make sure that the audience is, that this token is meant to be used for that API. You can get a bit more granular in terms of the permissions. So what you can do, you can define permissions at the API level, and then these permissions basically maybe correspond to one-on-one kind of API endpoints themselves. So you can define the actions that can be performed on that API, and on your token validation middleware, apart from checking that the token is valid and is meant to be for that API, you also want to make sure that the access token has the appropriate scopes or permissions to perform that action in the API. That could be, how do you do that? Basically, when you create a user, you can assign roles to that person. So you can create roles like this one, for example. Roles, essentially what they are is that they are a set of permissions. So you will choose an API, like for example, my expense API. You can choose what this role means, and then you can add this role to a user. So when the user logs into your application and they try to access your APIs, the API will know, let's say Auth0 is going to dump the appropriate permissions onto the token, so that the API knows whether that person should or not be given access to the API. This would be for the user-driven flow, because you can assign a role to a user. In other cases, when an application is not user-driven, which is more like a machine-to-machine, as I told earlier, you will create an instance of a machine-to-machine application, and then you want to define the APIs it can access and the actual scopes of that API they can do. So in this case, my machine-to-machine app, I can authorize it to also interact with this API, and it's going to give it access to read reports. So this application, what it could do, it could be a cron job. I will have permissions to only read the reports at my API, but it won't be able to create new expenses. Okay, I guess hopefully that's clear. Any questions on anything? Identity, Auth0, or anything related to APIs that I can answer? All right. So then, if there are no more questions, I guess I can finish the session earlier. There is one more. Okay, there goes. Does Auth0 have a strong authentication possibility via bank codes? So when you say strong authentication, yes, exactly. Okay, so that would be more like strong customer authentication for the banking industry. Yeah. So how that will play out, especially in the Nordics, right? How it works in the Nordics, because I got lots of clients. They also ask for it. Basically, in the Nordics, most of the people like to use electronic IDs, right? I can't think of any at the moment, actually, for in the Danish region, in Finland. So that would be, you can bring your identity, that it's an identity that is owned or stored by the government. So you can definitely do that. Now, the other option that you can do as well is, as part of the strong customer authenticator kind of requirement that is from PSD2 from the banking industry, what you can do is that you can, for some operations, you can require a second factor of authentication, and that would be more on the NFA landscape. This is something that we can see right here. This is multi-factor authentication. So here you can provide a second factor to really strengthen the level of trust of that identity before they can access an operation, before they can do anything. And this would be the example where, say, for example, you're logging into your banking app with your electronic ID. But then if you want to perform a transaction, then you also need to provide your second factor via, let's say, email or maybe via device biometrics. That's definitely possible. So, with Auth0, you can do 1, 2, or whatever, how many factors you actually see that are necessary for the transaction to occur. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay, the second one is, in terms of B2B, how much are enterprises worried about storing credentials and identity externally to their perimeters? Do you think back to their infrastructure or any other systems on demand, to their CRM or choice? Yeah, so that's in terms of, I think this is more about compliance kind of question, but yes, some companies cannot afford using, or let's say, cannot afford their internal employees creating a second identity to work, essentially because they're going to have, pretty important data that they manage, and at a compliance level, this data cannot be managed through external identities. It has to be managed by identities that are controlled by the company itself. So when you look into the B2B space, most typically what happens, and this happens mostly with large enterprises, compliance is a big factor over there. So they're going to have big, let's say, Azure AD repositories, most typically, or Azure AD or ADs, where the credentials are stored. So when they want to make business, or they want to buy a SaaS B2B solution, they're going to ask the customer, in this case will be the Auth0 customer, if they can bring in their identities through a enterprise connector. So this is how, as a customer, you can create a third-party connection to the IDPs, typically via SAML or any of the protocols, and this way, their compliance team or unit can rest assured that the actual management of that identities are sitting on the company itself. Because what Auth0 does is that anytime a user needs to authenticate, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna request, or we're gonna redirect the user to the company's IDP, where the identity sits, and the credentials are actually provided to the company. So say if they have their own login page or they have their own Azure AD instance, they will get redirected over there. They will provide the credentials, and then we'll get the information tokenized so that the client can use it. But the actual data and the lifecycle management of those users is controlled by the company itself. So if they change my name, for example, or they change my roles, they are responsible for it. They've got control over it. So yeah, that's a good question. That's something I personally see that happening much more with large companies than with the smaller ones. SMBs, not as much. Enterprises, yeah. Okay, so where is Auth0 customers' data stored? That's when you create a tenant, and this is something I'll show you. You can decide where would you want to store that information. We have, let's say, we are a global company, right? So you can store your information into different databases. Most likely, if you are in the European Union, you want to host your data in Europe because of GDPR reasons. In which case, your data will be stored in Frankfurt, and then you have a fallback in Ireland in case anything happens. So you get to choose where the user profile data is stored, and that's also a really good question, by the way. Yep. So I think that's it. I think it was 50 minutes. If you have any more questions, I believe my details are right here in the chat. Sorry, in the event. But I'm just gonna put my details here. If you'd like to continue, chatting with me, or if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot me an update or a message, and we can continue talking. Thank you so much for attending the webinar workshop. Hopefully you get something out of it. Hope to see you soon. Bye.